Make sure you stay till the end, because this isn't just a story, it's a blueprint for turning failure into success. Ethan's story begins not with failure, but with certainty. Growing up in a small rural town, life was defined by rhythm. The sun rose, the fields woke, and generations of farmers followed the same patterns year after year. For Ethan, the world felt simple then. Work hard, respect the land, honor the traditions, and the seasons would reward you. His earliest memories were filled with sunlight filtering through wheat, the smell of rich soil, and the quiet pride of watching crops grow under careful hands. He learned that patience was not passive, it was active, attentive, disciplined. Farming was not about control, but about observation, understanding, and trust. And for a long time, that trust seemed enough. As a child, he walked beside his father through the fields, listening to stories of past hardships and triumphs. Each story carried a lesson about endurance, humility, and foresight. Ethan learned that the land demanded respect and that it could teach lessons no school ever could. He watched his father examine soil, predict weather, and make decisions that seemed small but carried consequences for months to come. By the time he was old enough to take on responsibility, Ethan had absorbed a lifetime of knowledge. He believed he was prepared for anything, until the world began to quietly change. At first, the shifts were subtle. Rain came a little later. Summers stretched slightly longer. Soil that had once been fertile began to feel heavier, less yielding. Crops grew inconsistently, and small pests appeared in greater numbers. Ethan noticed these changes, but he interpreted them through the lens of his childhood training. Farming had always had unpredictable seasons. Surely this too would pass. He adjusted slightly, but his methods remained the same. And that was his first mistake. The first failed harvest arrived quietly, like a whisper of reality he wasn't ready to hear. Yield was lower than expected. Income barely covered expenses. He worked harder the next season, ignoring exhaustion, believing effort alone could compensate. But the second season was worse, and then the third. The losses weren't sudden, they were gradual, persistent, and unrelenting. They crept into every thought, every conversation, every decision. They settled in his bones, quiet but heavy, shaping how he saw himself and the world. Ethan began to wake before dawn, not with energy, but with anxiety. His body was tired, but his mind never rested. He calculated every risk, planned every day meticulously, and yet outcomes continued to fall short. Bills mounted, repairs were delayed. Every financial decision felt like a gamble with stakes higher than ever. The farm, once a source of pride, began to feel like a weight dragging him down. And with it, the identity he had built around being a capable provider started to crumble. At home, tension grew in ways that weren't spoken. His family noticed the change but didn't know how to reach him. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter became rare. The warmth that had once filled the house was replaced by an unspoken worry. Ethan tried to carry everything alone, believing that strength meant silence. But silence is not protection. It is isolation. And the longer it went on, the heavier it became. The nights were worse than the days. When the town grew quiet, Ethan's mind filled with questions he couldn't answer. What if he wasn't capable? What if his efforts had been wasted? What if everything he had learned, everything he had trusted, no longer applied? He compared himself to others farmers who seemed to adapt faster, neighbors who diversified successfully, people who found paths he hadn't considered. And each comparison planted a seed of self-doubt that grew quietly into despair. Walking through the fields, Ethan felt the weight of every past failure. The soil, once familiar and comforting, now felt indifferent. The plants, once partners in life, now seemed fragile and stubborn. The very land that had defined his identity now mirrored the uncertainty that had begun to define him. And in the quiet of those fields, a dangerous thought began to take hold. Maybe quitting was the only way to end this pain. It was not an emotional, sudden impulse. It was calm, logical, and terrifyingly rational. Standing there at sunset, Ethan realized how close he was to abandoning everything. He felt the full weight of responsibility, expectation, and the quiet voice of generations past whispering into his mind. The thought of walking away brought both relief and guilt. Relief, because it would stop the struggle. Guilt, because it would betray a lifetime of effort, loyalty, and identity. It was at that moment that Uncle Robert appeared. The elderly man had lived through cycles of abundance and scarcity, prosperity and hardship, hope and despair. He had seen generations rise and fall, fields flourish and die, and communities rebuild from nothing. He did not arrive with solutions. He arrived with presence. He did not speak until Ethan had spoken every word he had been holding inside. He listened to fears, doubts, regrets, and confessions with patience. And then, when silence was long enough, he spoke. He told Ethan that struggle is not punishment, it is direction. That the world does not reward effort blindly. It rewards adaptation. That persistence without reflection is stubbornness. That identity tied solely to what has worked in the past becomes a trap when the past no longer fits the present. His words were gentle, but they hit deeper than any critique or admonition could. He reminded Ethan that failure is never final unless it is accepted without learning. And he reminded him that the hardest moments are often the prelude to the greatest growth. Ethan did not feel comforted immediately. Instead, he felt exposed. Fear returned, fear of the unknown, fear of the unknown, fear of failing even when trying something different. But beneath that fear was a flicker of clarity. Staying the same was no longer neutral. Staying the same would ensure continued struggle, not survival. For the first time in months, Ethan realized he had a choice. Quitting would end the pain, but it would also end possibility. Changing, uncertain as it was, offered hope. He chose to stay. And he chose to change. The following months were some of the hardest of his life. Learning again felt humiliating. He had to dismantle assumptions, unlearn habits, and admit that knowledge he had trusted for years was no longer sufficient. He studied soil science, irrigation methods, crop rotation, sustainable practices, and even technology he had dismissed as unnecessary. Every day felt like a battle between comfort and progress. Mistakes were expensive. Doubt was constant. There were days when he questioned if he had started too late, but slowly the land began to respond. Subtle changes at first. Moisture retention improved, roots strengthened, plants grew more resilient. Then incremental progress turned into visible growth. Ethan began observing patterns he had overlooked for decades. He listened instead of assuming. He adjusted instead of insisting. He learned to work with the land, not against it, and to accept that progress is rarely dramatic, it is measured in small, persistent improvements. Through this process, Ethan transformed not only the farm but himself. He discovered that resilience is not endurance alone, it is the willingness to evolve, to question, and to adapt. That identity is not fixed, it must grow with circumstances. That failure is not the opposite of success, it is a teacher demanding humility and reflection. And he realized that the discomfort that had once crushed him was exactly what had forced him to grow in ways comfort never could. When the next harvest came, it was abundant, but the yield itself was not the true reward. The reward was clarity, perspective, and wisdom earned through struggle. Ethan no longer feared uncertainty. He no longer measured success by immediate results. He measured it by alignment, understanding, and responsiveness. Standing in the fields at sunrise, he understood what so many people fail to grasp. The most important transformations happen quietly during the hardest moments when no one is watching and when it feels like nothing is changing. Ethan's journey reminds us that struggle is rarely the enemy. It is often a guide. The moment you feel like quitting is rarely the end, it is the edge. The edge between who you were and who you are meant to become, between repetition and reinvention, between stubbornness and wisdom. Quitting ends struggle. Adapting transforms it. And sometimes the bravest, most transformative act is not walking away. It is staying, observing, learning, adapting, and becoming someone new, one choice at a time. Because life will always test what you know, challenge what you believe, and push you to evolve. Those who survive are not always the strongest. They are the ones who can change, who can grow, who can transform struggle into wisdom, and who understand that failure is only final when learning stops. If Ethan's journey taught you anything, let it remind you that transformation begins the moment you choose to keep going. Subscribe and join us for more stories that change lives.